Two major wars rumble on around the world, and tensions are high on the Korean peninsula. It's against this backdrop that NATO marks the 75 years of its alliance. This year's NATO summit is taking place in Washington, D.C. this week, where not only 32 NATO members are invited, but also 4 Indo-Pacific countries, including South Korea and Japan. We take a closer look at this high-stakes meeting and what this means for this whole Washington-Tokyo cooperation. This special discussion is co-produced by Ari랑Tv and Voice of America. I'm Yoon Jung-min, anchor of Arirang's News Center here in Seoul. I will be co-hosting this roundtable with Eun Jung-cho, VOA Korean State Department correspondent and host of Washington Talk over in Washington. Good to see you, Eun Jung.
Hello, Jung-min, connecting to you from the Voice of America headquarters in Washington. With me is Mr. Richard Lawless. Mr. Lawless, thank you for joining us.
Delighted, thank you.
Mr. Richard Lawless is founding principal of NMV Consulting. Mr. Lawless was former Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Asian and Pacific Security Affairs and also served as Deputy Head of the U.S. delegation to the Beijing Six-Party Talks. Back to you, Jung-min.
Right, thanks, Eun Jung. And we also have 2 more experts joining us for the discussion. Nam Sung-wook, president of the Convergence Institute for National Unification at Korea University, joins us. Professor Nam also served as a president of the Institute for National Security Strategy. Welcome, Professor.
Thank you.
Thank you. And Koichi Yonemura, Deputy Foreign News Editor of Mainichi newspaper, also joins us virtually. Mr. Yonemura, thank you for your time.
Thank you for inviting me.
All right, thank you all for joining us. It's a pleasure to meet you. Professor Nam, let's start off with you. This year's NATO summit is coming at a time when North Korea continues ratcheting up provocations, having recently signed a renewed military agreement with Russia. While some signs of a rift have been spotted between Pyongyang and Beijing, what will be on the discussion table when President Yoon Suk-yeol meets his counterparts in Washington, including U.S. President Joe Biden and Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida?
Yeah, I think there are various kind of issues on the tables. First of all, the security issue is urgent. As you know, the North Korea and Russia have signed last month, and then strategic comprehensive partnership treaty. That is practically equivalent to a military alliance. That this is evident both countries explicitly mention the common enemy. Therefore, the Seoul and Washington and Tokyo will plead the trilateral security cooperation to counter the enhanced relationship between North Korea and Russia. The rising tensions between 2 Koreas increasingly linked to Russia invasion of Ukraine. Another issue is the Russia invaded Ukraine since the 2020s. Therefore, it is important for NATO members and another country, I4 countries, to continue support the Ukraine in urgent issue.
Mm-hmm. Right, no doubt this NATO summit is taking place at a very sensitive time. All right, Mr. Lawless, Washington has not only warned of arms cooperation between Moscow and Pyongyang for the war in Ukraine, but also the possibility of North Korea sending its troops to Ukraine following the Kim Jong-un-Putin summit a few weeks ago. What's the assessment in the U.S. about the recent security developments on the Korean peninsula? How is Washington seeking to address this issue with its allies and partners?
Thank you. I do believe that we've taken a close look at this new arrangement, if you will, this deepening relationship between Putin's Russia and Kim's North Korea, and pretty much concluded that it's a marriage of convenience and it's a marriage of desperation on the part of Mr. Putin. We do not believe, at least I do not believe, that this will materially change the status of the Korean Peninsula or the threat. And I do think that the only concern here is that the Russians and Putin are so desperate that they would be willing to trade selected military technology for continued North Korean support. And that's the area which we're looking at most closely, because there are certain things the North Koreans need to improve their strategic capabilities vis-a-vis the United States, Japan particularly, and South Korea. So that's the biggest concern, but otherwise it is a move signaling Putin's desperation given his situation in the Ukraine.
Mr. Yonemura, NATO has invited 4 Indo-Pacific partners. They are South Korea, Japan, Australia, and New Zealand. For 3 years straight, what cooperation is NATO seeking with the Indo-Pacific? Do we expect a joint document between NATO and the 4 partners, the very first of its kind?
I am not sure about that, but I think we've been invited for Japan and South Korea and Australia and New Zealand were invited for 3 years. That means it's about more about China. In one word, China increases its assertive actions in this region, and it is essential to maintain order based on the rule of law. Through alliances with the United States in this region, and specifically concerning Taiwan and South China Sea. And I think the AP4 is especially important if Mr. Trump becomes the president of the United States, as these 4 countries share the common goal of preserving a free and democratic order in this region.
All right, now let's go over to our friends in Washington again. Eun-jung, would you like to weigh in?
Right here in Washington, VOA studio with Mr. Lawless. Mr. Lawless, the U.S., South Korea, and Japan's main discussion with NATO members will likely be curbing North Korea, Russia's cooperation, and also joint response to China's coercive actions. Now, some say that there are room for cooperation with China when it comes to North Korea, Russia cooperation. But how can one seek cooperation with China while keeping pace with NATO's pressure campaign against China?
You know, it's a great question. I don't really think that it's possible to seek greater cooperation with China at this point. The real question is, Mr. Kishida, Prime Minister Kishida, and President Yoon come here, and they're looking for a relationship, improved relationship with NATO. It's a very important move on their part. The question is, what does NATO expect to get in return for its support of the Republic of Korea and Japan? It expects cooperation on the Ukraine. And so, as the U.S. ambassador in Tokyo has said, as others have said, it's time for both Republic of Korea and Japan to step up and help the NATO allies support the Ukraine. To me, that's the big issue here at this meeting. And Kishida and Yoon will be asked, what are you prepared to do to support the Ukraine beyond just good words? We need deeds.
Of course, the main topic would be Ukraine war. But when NATO announced its 10-year new strategy, it did say China is the biggest threat. How do you think NATO perceives China as a threat?
I think NATO perceives China as a threat, as a major disruptor, as a major distraction. For example, if there was a war in the Far East, if there was a conflict over Taiwan, if there was a conflict over the Republic of Korea and the Korean Peninsula in which China stood to gain, all of that is a net negative for NATO and its posture in Europe, because it distracts the United States military, it distracts our policies. So again, I think NATO sees China as a potential security disruptor more than anything. And that's why the other countries in NATO will be looking to the Republic of Korea and to Japan to do more with regard to helping NATO.
Mm-hmm. Now, Mr. Yonemura, NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg said there is strong need to reinforce cooperation with AP4 countries to intensify pressure on China. But the interests of Japan and South Korea do not fully coincide with those of the US and NATO when it comes to the need to put pressure on China and how hard to push China. Is there a good balance to overcome these differences? Why is Japan much more vocal than South Korea on the Taiwan issue despite China's opposition?
Well, I think you're right. I mean, our position and NATO or United States, America's position towards China is slightly different. in the joint statement from the Japan-Korea-China summit held in late May, it was something there was something a bit interesting that we put that we said that commitment to an international order based on the rule of law was affirmed in that commitment, a joint statement. And although there are difference, of course, the difference between our understanding of rule of law and China's, but still, it was significant that China accepted this term due to the efforts of Japanese and Korean diplomats. And China's attitude towards Japan and Korea has slightly changed after the summit, possibly due to China's economic struggles over the past few years. And the success of the Japan-Korea-China summit indicates that Japan and Korea have their own ways of restraining China's behavior. And about the difference of Korean attitude and Japanese attitudes, I think the difference between Japan and Korea regarding the Taiwan issue is primarily due to Korea prioritizing the North Korean issue, while from Japanese point of view, Taiwan issue and North Korean issue is both important, and for Japan, counteracting China's actions regarding Taiwan is as crucial as addressing the North Korean issue. So that is a difference, I think.
But do you think now that given there's more cooperation between United States, South Korea, and Japan, do you think South Korea should align more with Japan and U.S.'s stance in having a strong stance against China?
Yes, I do. And well, when I talk with South Korean experts, their point of view on Taiwan is quite similar to us. Just, it is difficult for South Korean government to say that openly because, as I said before, the North Korea is more important than Taiwan for South Korean point of view. That's what I understand.
Professor Nam, unlike Japan, the Korean Peninsula borders China and Russia, and South Korea has been quite cautious in dealing with these countries, not only on economic and diplomatic issues, but also on geopolitical issues, as we just touched upon with Mr. Yonemura. At a time when competition between the U.S. and China is intensifying, does the balanced diplomacy pursued by previous Korean governments still have merit? Or is it in the ROK's national interest to actively align itself with the U.S.-Asia strategy, forge a stronger common front with NATO, and counter the coercive behavior of China and Russia?
Yeah, it's very complicated questions. As Ms. Joel says, South Korea has a little difference with the Japan policy, with the China and Russia's. The balanced diplomacy pursued by foreign governments has not been effective because its fundamental problem is just North Korea and Russia has formed the virtual military alliance. And then another point is the Russia invaded Ukraine 3 years ago. South Korea have no balanced policy toward the surrounding countries. However, there are wide differences between toward the China and Russia. And the South Korean Minister of Foreign Affairs Jo Tae-yeol met with the Chinese counterpart Wang Yi in May, emphasized the critical need for Seoul and Beijing to sustain the movement of cooperation while carefully managing any difference to prevent the escalation in conflict. South Korea does not view foreign relations with China as zero-sum games. President Yoon Suk-yeol administration will keep the strategic alignment to the U.S. but maintain its partnership with the Beijing in potential area of cooperation. Korea is still heavily reliant on United States China, regardless export, also the level of reliance has been reduced recently. US and China combined accounted for 38% of Korea total export in last year. We should keep in economic alliance with US and China.
Professor Nam, talks are likely to center on supporting Ukraine when NATO members gather. The South Korean government has recently signaled a potential shift in its policy regarding weapons provision for Ukraine in response to the Pyongyang-Moscow military assistance agreement. Russia has reacted against it. What are the prospects?
Yeah, it's very delicate and complicated questions. South Korea have humanitarian and financial aid to Ukraine until now. However, there are sudden variables come out. As you know, the North Korea and Russia signed the treaties. It treaty includes the autonomous military intervention in the event of the attacks its counterparts. South Korea feels a threat from the treaty. Therefore, we will reconsider the attitude and policy toward the Ukraine. And South Korean National Security Advisor Jang Ho-jin emphasized if Russia cross the line, South Korea will support the weapon and lethal weapons to the Ukraine. This means that if Russia supports the cyber technology, aerospace technology, and the missile technology, even nuclear technology to support the North Korea, South Korea changed the policy and then support the lethal weapon to the Ukraine. However, South Korea watching out the Russian policy. However, Russian President Vladimir Putin warned the South Korea, if South Korea will support the lethal weapon to the Ukraine, it will make a big mistake. And therefore, both countries exercise the ball in the court, ball in your court. It's not court. And we watch out the Russia and North Korean transaction, and we watch out the both countries' military exchange and support.
So it's a little hard to tell for now whether South Korean government will actually transition its policy, you're saying?
Yes, South Korea have a very delicate position. South Korea wants to dialogue with Russia and Moscow. However, Putin has an ambitious policy toward Seoul. He sometimes the South Korea don't worry about South Korea because the South Korea do not attack the Pyongyang. It's no situation happen. However, if they secretly support the cyber technology, aerospace technology, nuclear technology to Pyongyang, South Korea feels serious threat from both countries, and South Korea will every kind consider the options, and then leader South Korean artillery weapon is very famous for the excellent ability to attack the enemies. However, it's the very delicate policies.
All right. My next question to you, Mr. Yonemura. Japan and Ukraine signed a 10-year security agreement last month on the sidelines of the G7 summit, pledging non-lethal defense supplies and financial contributions. Do you think any upgraded discussions will be made during this year's NATO meeting? Also, what are the prospects of the leaders placing additional sanctions against Russia and entities based in a third country that have been circumventing sanctions?
Yes. Well, with the accord signed in June, just only 1 month ago, so an upgrade seems unlikely. But well, Japanese public opinion strongly support Ukraine's position, and they are very willing to support Europe, because if something happens later in East Asia, we want support. We need support from NATO and Europe. And regarding sanctions, Japan will not take the lead, but will follow the action of the United States and the EU.
And Mr. Lawless, the U.S. has invited foreign ministers of Israel and several Arab countries to the NATO summit. What does this extended invitation mean when conflicts rage on in the Middle East?
I think it's legitimate, timely attempt to bring those countries into a broader security understanding of all the issues that NATO faces, and coincidentally, all the issues we face in Asia, particularly having those people here and understanding the balance that the United States has to strike between supporting Europe and supporting Asia. It's very important to drive this home to the countries you just mentioned that are preoccupied, of course, with their Middle Eastern problems. So we have here an opportunity, and I welcome what NATO has done in inviting not only Japan, Korea, Australia, New Zealand as observers, but also bringing the other people to the table so they can see what NATO has to deal with, and ideally what Japan and the Republic of Korea have to deal with. It's very important that everybody understands the breadth and the depth and the complexity of the threats we all together face. And that certainly would include Asia. So this may be the first situation where you have not only our U.S. allies in the Pacific dialoguing directly with NATO members, but also others observing this process and understanding what the obligations of the United States are vis-a-vis every quarter of the world.
Now we're back here in the VOA studio in Washington. Mr. Lawless, North Korea condemned the trilateral multi-domain exercises Freedom Edge as an Asian version of NATO. The United States rejected that claim. Now, isn't there a possibility, though, that such advanced trilateral military exercises could evolve to align with NATO's goal in the region? Do you think the additional steps are needed in terms of joint drills in order to align with NATO's goal in the region? In the region, you have China and Russia.
I think it's a great question, a great opening for me. I think we've talked about this before, but we really want to see much greater integration at the operational level between the Republic of Korea and Japan. That makes our understandings and our respective alliances tangible. It makes them real. And as NATO looks, because of the character of the alliance, that's a very high quality, very well integrated alliance. As NATO looks at our respective relationships, the United States relationships with Japan and separately with Korea, they're asking themselves how integrated and how real is this security package in Asia, because they want to make their own decision about how NATO should look at Japan and the Republic of Korea. So this is an important exercise, and I think it's very worthwhile what's happening here.
Now, Mr. Yonemura, North Korea's continued provocations, its closer ties with Russia, and China's military buildup are obviously threats to Japan as well. But some in South Korea are concerned about Japan's reinterpretation of its defense-only policy to include offensive capabilities and a massive defense buildup. Is the current security crisis in Northeast Asia a golden opportunity for Japan to become a normal country that can fight wars? And just as the Korean War was a reason for U.S. policy toward Japan to reverse course and pave the way for the formation of the self-defense forces?
Well, I understand their concern because I used to live and work in Seoul for a couple of years. But now, looking at the East Asia region, where U.S.-China, U.S.-North Korea, and U.S.-Russia confrontation exists, the only non-nuclear party, Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan. And there is an observation that low-intensity conflicts are likely to occur in situations where nuclear deterrence is functioning among nuclear states, known as stability-instability paradox. To prevent nuclear states from easily starting conflict in East Asia, Japan, ROK, and Taiwan need to possess solid conventional military capabilities. Strengthening Korea's military power benefits Japan and vice versa. And as any conflict in the Korean Peninsula or Taiwan or as in the South China Sea will significantly impact the lives of both Japanese and Korean citizens. And also about the golden opportunity, frankly speaking, this is not the golden opportunity for Japan, which faces serious issues of an aging population and low birth rates. Japan would prefer to increase its budget for social welfare and education rather than defense spending. So the increase in military is seen as necessity rather than a choice.
Now, Professor Nam, NATO has invited Korea and AP4 to its summit for the third straight year. There are conflicting opinions in Korea about cooperation with NATO. Some say South Korea should play a global pivotal role among like-minded democratic countries, while others warn that South Korea could be drawn into the Ukraine war or the Taiwan contingency. To what extent should South Korea cooperate with NATO? And what role does South Korea expect NATO to play in the Korean crisis? A direct deployment of soldiers?
I sometimes imagined without the Ukraine wars, President Yoon can visit the NATO summits. Anyways, with the invasion of Russia, Ukraine, South Korea also involved the NATO meetings, summit meetings. And therefore, I conclude it's the butterfly effect. It means that the long range, long distance, the war will make impact on Korean Peninsula. Anyway, South Korea was invited to the NATO summit for the third consecutive year as one of the non-NATO partners in the Indo-Pacific regions, which include Japan, Australia, and New Zealand. President Yoon attended the two previous NATO summits held in Spain 2 years ago and Lithuania in last years. The core topic of the NATO summit are security issues of the Europe and the Indo-Pacific, as well as the ongoing war in Ukraine. Whatever the specifics may be, it is important for South Korea to align its stance with the United States regarding the NATO summit. However, South Korea should avoid making an excessive proposal. For example, providing the lethal weapon to Ukraine or proposing the cooperation scheme that involve the NATO actions in forced caution. South Korea have an ambitious perspective to support the lethal weapons to Ukraine. One point is the South Korea should show up the conventional arm capabilities. As you know, South Korea exports the worldwide weapon. However, it will be a great pivot role in worldwide peace and prosperous countries. However, another point is the South Korea violates the domestic diplomatic rules. South Korea should not embroiled the trouble and conflict, do not attack the South Korea directly. And then South Korea have some dilemmas. South Korea National Security Advisor emphasized that if Russia supports the North Korea and precision weapon, it means that and satellite image technology and and the long-range missile and the ICBM technology. And South Korea will support the lethal weapons to Ukraine. However, it's very complicated problems.
So, Professor Nam, you said because of South Korea's domestic laws, it'll be very complicated for South Korea to actually provide lethal weapons to Ukraine. Then why did you think, you just mentioned the National Security Advisor, from what I remember at least twice, said that South Korea may consider providing lethal weapons to Ukraine. Was he just threatening Russia and North Korea?
Yeah, it's the very delicate views. If Russia supports the North Korea with precision weapon, and then North Korea developed the high technology weapons like the ICBM technology and the high precision weapon. They will attack the Seoul and the metropolitan areas precisely, and then we should defend the threat from Pyongyang, and then we should stop the Russian support the North Korea high technology. Therefore, we have a leverage. We have a leverage to prevent the Moscow supports the Pyongyang. If Russia violates the red line, South Korea have another leverage card. We also support the Ukraine with the lethal weapons. And then we hope the Russia have established the reasonable policy toward the North Korea, even if they have signed the treaty, a comprehensive strategic partnership treaty. However, we hope the Russia have a reasonable attitude toward the Pyongyang.
Now back to Arirang studio in Seoul.
Professor Nam, let's talk about economic security, cooperation. Trade ministers of South Korea, the U.S. and Japan recently met in Washington to bolster their three-way cooperation on chips, core minerals, and clean energy. What's worth noticing when it comes to the latest economic security and supply chain cooperation?
Yeah, economic issues are very softer compared to the security issues. I am very comfortable to talk about the economic issues. First of all, the trilateral partnership between Washington and Tokyo and Seoul is not about any country. It's not about China. Korean Industry Minister An and his Japanese counterparts held talks in Washington last week. They agreed to launch work groups on cooperation in supply chain for the clean hydrogen and ammonia and other areas. Relations extend to economic cohesion, the intersection of the technology and national security, innovation, economic investment and vitality. All areas where the three countries have a huge amount of complementary capacity to support and lift one another. It is about being for something, a vision for the worldwide. And Korea and Japan both expand the cooperation to stabilize the global supply chain, including the key mineral as well. Both countries agreed to expand the cooperation based on Seoul carbon-free energy initiative, according to the Ministry of Trade in Korea. Both countries vowed also to expand the cooperation to stabilize the global supply chain, and including every kind of minerals also. My point is not against China. It's we develop the economic capacity.
Okay, so perhaps the area with little contention.
Yeah.
And Mr. Lawless, eyes are on the U.S. presidential election in November. Well, not just America, but many other countries have closely watched the recent first televised debate between President Joe Biden and former President Donald Trump ahead of their rematch. Do you think there will be a notable change in the U.S. relationship with the allies and partners over the next 4 years if former President Trump is reelected?
Well, that's a tough one, but let me take it on. However, before I do that, I would like to comment on one thing that Professor Nam said so well. The Russian relationship with Pyongyang, Putin's relationship with Kim, in announcing it, it was basically a preemptive attempt to intimidate the Republic of Korea into not supporting, with lethal weapons or otherwise, the Ukraine war. It is a great comment, and it's true. Putin was attempting to intimidate the Republic of Korea, make no mistake about it. But the great comment is that Republic of Korea pushed back, and they said, we have options too. And the great thing about the Yoon government is, and his national security team, they recognized this and they pushed back. And they said, we're going to watch you, Russia, and if you do certain things to enhance the capabilities of North Korea, we have options, lethal options, to support the Ukraine. So I think it's really a standoff, if you will, but I compliment the Republic of Korea government in recognizing this and preemptively going back to Putin and saying, Mr. Putin, we have options too. Regarding a potential President Trump administration, I think not all the cards are on the table, but certainly the President Trump would-be security team has indicated that they probably will expect more from both Japan, Korea, and other countries in the region, Republic of Korea. That doesn't mean to say that there's going to be a fundamental change in policy. Mr. Trump scared people in the past with his engagement with North Korea, particularly the way that it came about. The non-sharing of information, the preemptiveness, the Bonhomme attitude toward North Korea's leader. I don't think Mr. Trump will be that, reckless in his approach to a North Korea relationship as he was in the past, because it was reckless and it was ill-advised. And I think when Trump recognized that the North Koreans were not prepared to disarm nuclear capability, he stood up from the table, said this meeting's over, and went and got on the plane and came home. That won't happen again under a Trump administration. I can predict no more than that, and we just need to wait until November to see who our next president of the United States is.
Of course, we will have to wait and see. And Mr. Yonemura, Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida has been willing to meet North Korean leader Kim Jong-un on the issue of Japanese nationals abducted by the regime decades ago. In March, the regime revealed Kishida's proposal for a summit, but dismissed it soon after. What's the summit outlook?
Yes, Prime Minister Kishida indeed willing to communicate and negotiate with North Korea. And like you said, it is something to do with his low approval rate. He wants to do something with North Korea to push up his approval rate. However, on March 25, Kim Yo-jong, Chairman Kim Jong-un's sister, expressed the desire for improving relationship if Japan made a political decision. And the following days, she issued a contradictory statement rejecting any contact or negotiation with Japan. The question is why North Korea made a positive statement about negotiations with Japan at first, even though they don't seem interested in actual negotiation. On February 15, Kim Yo-jong mentioned that if Japan stops criticizing North Korea's right to self-defense and doesn't use the resolved abduction issue as a hindrance to relations, then Prime Minister Kishida might be allowed to visit Pyongyang someday. That's what Kim Yo-jong said. And this means if Japan wants to negotiate with North Korea, they must drop all conditions related to abductions, nuclear weapons, and missiles. Now, I believe by emphasizing the high hurdles of negotiations, North Korea is sending a message not only to Japan, not just to Japan, but also to the United States and South Korea. they want to tell us that bringing difficult conditions like complete denuclearization will only lead to failure, as it did in 2019. So don't ever try that. That is the message I understand from North Korea's behavior.
All right, back to the VOA studio in Washington.
Now we're back here in Washington. Mr. Lawless, NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg said that at some point there needed to be consequences for China's support to Russia's defense industry. How can NATO impose cost on China while still maintaining global stability? And what does NATO, including the United States, expect from South Korea and Japan when making China pay for its wrongdoings?
I think there's very little NATO can do to impose a cost on China. China is going to continue to support Russia the way that it's supporting it now, financially, energy-wise, microelectronics-wise. But the important thing to remember here is that essentially Russia has accepted a subordinate relationship to China. China is now the big dog, and Russia has to come and prostrate themselves. Putin does. So if we look at the Putin, Xi Jinping, Kim relationship, there's an interesting dynamic there. And of course the Chinese, who never have had any degree of real control over North Korea, are watching this play out. So I think it's a very interesting situation, and to answer your question, I think NATO's ability to impose costs on China is extremely limited.
You just talked about how China indirectly supports Russia, only supplying economic aid and only supporting its defense industry. Do you think China thinks that North Korea is doing the dirty work of supplying lethal weapons to Russia and quietly happy about that?
No, I don't think they're happy about anything in the North Korean-Russian relationship. If I were China, having a near total lack of control over the Kim regime and over North Korea, would look at this as an infringement on my limited ability to control or even influence the North Koreans. So this is not Happy Valley among those three countries. And if anything, Putin is tweaking or pinching the nose of the Chinese and saying, I can have a relationship with Pyongyang and you can't, which is the reality of the situation.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. North Korea plays off big countries like, during the Trump presidency, he had symmetry, and then now between Russia and China, North Korea has that keenness yes. in there.
It's interesting. There's a Korean expression, wangta, and I think they are the ultimate bad boys, and the bad boys have the ability to cause trouble. And the great thing about the North Koreans is, it's not great, but it's unfortunate, they have the ability to drive everybody crazy. And we've seen them in the six-party trucks literally drive the Chinese crazy. And I think as long as they now have a nuclear weapons capability and appear irrationally willing to use it, it only increases their influence. So China doesn't want anything to happen on the Korean Peninsula. It just wants it to stay quiet. And the more that Putin and Russia come into this equation, the more instability it injects. So I think it's a really interesting time for China watching this dynamic evolve.
Now, Mr. Yonemura, what is Japan's position on South Korea joining the Quad? And do you think South Korea and Japan need to join AUKUS? And many in Washington oppose South Korea's nuclear drive. How does Japan view South Korean politicians and public's call for nuclear armament?
Well, first of all, that Japanese government has not clarified its stance on South Korea joining the Quad, as far as I know. And that, however, the goal of maintaining an order in Indo-Pacific region based on the rule of law aligns with South Korea's stance. Given the relatively stable Japan-South Korea relationship right now, thanks to both leaders, there is no apparent reason for Japan to oppose. But also I have to emphasize that last year, U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary who visited Tokyo met with the media and said there are no plans for expansion of the Quad at present. And about AUKUS, well, Japan is reported to cooperate with AUKUS in fields such as AI and hypersonic missiles. And Japan is positive about cooperation, but not so enthusiastic about joining AUKUS. Prime Minister Kishida stated in April press conference that Japan will cooperate with the US, UK, and Australia on bilateral or multilateral basis, but has no current plans for specific cooperation with AUKUS. And about nuclear weapons, firstly, Japanese public remains strongly opposed to nuclear weapons. Opinion polls shows in 2023 or 23 last year, around 60% support for the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. So that means banning all the nuclear weapons, and 60% of Japanese public support that. And secondly, while the situation and the public opinion on nuclear weapons in South Korea are widely reported in Japan, I myself wrote some article about that, but many people in Japan think that such aspirations are just unrealistic.
So, Mr. Yonemura, people say if South Korea gets nuclear weapons, then Japan will want nuclear weapons and Taiwan will want nuclear weapons. But based on what you're saying, we shouldn't worry about nuclear domino in Northeast Asia.
Yes, because, even though South Korea wants to have nuclear weapons, we think that it is impossible. If it became possible, then the story will be different. But right now, I don't see there are any possibility that South Korea can have their own nuclear capability.
Professor Nam, what specific results has NATO's expanded cooperation with Indo-Pacific countries achieved so far? Have there been any unnecessary challenges or problems along the way? What steps are needed to ensure that South Korea-NATO relationship continues to be mutually beneficial in the future?
Yeah, South Korea is increasing pressures to use the upcoming NATO summits as a leverage to manage the strength ties between North Korea and Russia. During the President Yoon attendance summit in Lithuania, President Yoon called for the NATO united response to the North Korean nuclear and missile programs, stressing that Pyongyang belligerence also pose an actual threat to European countries. However, the South Korea have some ambiguous attitude to lethal weapon to the Ukraine. South Korea local politics is very complicated. The opposition parties, the majority in Congress in South Korea. Even if National Security Advisor Jang Ho-jin said last month, South Korea will not be bound by anything with regard to assistance to Ukraine if Russia provides North Korea with precision weapon. Opposition party strongly oppose the government position. Therefore, even if the President Yoon participates in the NATO and I4 meetings, it's not very delicate. It's very delicate problem for South Korea to move closer to the Ukraine support. I don't know. I'm not in position of the government positions. It's a very delicate politics. It will depend on the Russian policy in the futures.
Don't you think South Korea has this specific role that it can play, being among the liberal democratic countries? South Korea is about the only country that has this conventional weapons capability
Yeah,
that can help Ukraine.
Yeah, as you said, South Korea and North Korea has developed the conventional arms since the 1953 Korean War truce. South Korea was supported the UN collective powers 70 years ago. Therefore, the South Korea has also responsibility to support the Ukraine by attack the Russia. However, it is very delicate times for government to make a decision to support the in lethal weapon to the Ukraine now. South Korea opposition party have strongly have antagonized the position to support the Ukraine. Therefore, the poll survey showed that 55% have a negative attitude to support the Ukraine weapons. It's a very complicated problem in local politics in Korea.
Mr. Lawless, anything you'd like to add before we hand over to Seoul?
I do. You know, the lethal weapons issue for both Republic of Korea and Japan, I take your point, Professor Nam. The issue is, if we leave aside the lethal weapons, let's put them to the side for a second and recognize it's a very complicated issue politically. There's a lot more that Republic of Korea and Japan can do for the Ukraine. The Ukraine is going to need massive rebuilding capability. It's going to need a significant across-the-board program in rebuilding its infrastructure, its electrical infrastructure, the generators, the power lines that Russia is systematically destroying. The question is, what is the Republic of Korea and Japan going to do to substantially increase their ability to help the Ukraine rebuild now what is being destroyed? That's something that both Republic of Korea and Japan can bring to this NATO summit and tell the NATO partners, look, the lethal weapon issue is a problem for us, but we stand behind the Ukraine, and this is a tangible, multi-billion-dollar, extensive program. We're going to take charge of rebuilding the Ukraine electrical system or the transportation system, because Japan and the Republic of Korea are masters at this, and they can turn this on tomorrow. To me, that would be a very substantial contribution that President Yoon, on behalf of the Republic of Korea, forget about the opposition parties in Korea complaining, just committing to rebuild the infrastructure of the Ukraine. And you know what? They haven't done that yet, and they could do it tomorrow.
Well, on that note, back to you, Jung-min.
Okay, a lot to dissect. Indeed, key security events taking place this week. We will be closely following those. I want to thank you all, our experts, and Eun-jung, for your time and your insights. Now, that concludes our discussion, and to all of our viewers, thank you for watching.